right? Those who were able-bodied, they would actually, if they came to apply for a license, they were referred to the Ministry of Manpower then to either be upskilled.
Which is very different from what the national policy is now, right?
Yeah, it's very different.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Hello and welcome to Local Politics.
Hi Vanan, how are you? Welcome
Good.
back.
Thank you. How was your holiday?
It was quite nice. I was out of the country for 4 nights, and I went to Melbourne, and I spent most of it watching Netflix.
Oh God.
So I was attending a wedding, but
sure.
yeah, I really needed to sleep. So
Good. Now, well, good to have you back. And on top of having you back, we also have a guest on today,
Yes.
Mr. Ryan Kueh.
Hi Ryan, welcome.
Welcome to Local Politics. Just so you know, we have a tagline: no agendas, just answers.
Okay.
But I'm sure we'll discuss that later with you. Ryan has written a book called From Streets to Stalls. It's very much on the topic that we are going to be talking about today, on hawker culture. So actually, it's really nice to have you on this podcast, Ryan.
Yes. From streets to stalls, in paperback now.
Yes.
I mean, it's a plug for the book, but also Ryan has spent a lot of time writing about hawker culture, and you just published a book, you just launched a book.
Yep.
And so we thought it would be a very good idea to get you on to kind of talk not only about your research, but also around the politics of hawker culture in Singapore.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Ryan, welcome to the show. It's nice to have you. First of all, I think before we start, I think we wanted to just ask you a little bit how you got interested in the topic. I think you were mentioning earlier that it came up from some of your undergraduate studies. How did you get involved in trying to understand hawker culture, both, I guess, from a sociological perspective, but also from a, I guess, political perspective too?
Yeah. So thank you, Vanan, thank you, Dan, for having me on this show. So I think for me, I really got interested into this project when I was an undergrad student. Mostly after we got awarded the UNESCO Heritage, the UNESCO recognition. Because as a young person that grew up in the age of hawker centers, I was quite curious why we got the award over, say, Malaysia or Thailand or the other street food heavyweights, right? And central to the nomination was the idea of the hawker center. It wasn't, I think Singapore wasn't trying to propose the food per se, but that we have this space that we perform street food out of. Right, and so that got me interested in the hawker center history itself. I dug deeper. I read Prof. Lily Kong's book, Prof. Lai Chi Kian's book as well. But I think most of them look at it from urban history, urban design sort of background. I think what I really wanted was to try and situate it, or to see if you can situate it within Singapore's history, Singapore's political history, or Singapore's political economy as well. I think that's what the book tries to achieve, right? To see why do people turn to hawking, whether hawkers could have existed before the colonial era, why was there a need specifically for hawker centers, right? Beyond, like, let's say, the markets you have in like Malaysia, for example.
I wanted to know a little bit more about what Singapore's hawker culture was like when we became independent. So, you split up the progress of hawker culture in Singapore into 3 kind of distinct periods, and the third one being from the time we became independent. Maybe you can just kind of briefly describe what was the scene like here in 1965, but a bit more than that, how did the colonial period in Singapore, 1819 to 1965, how did that period kind of contribute to Singapore's like unique, I guess, cultural heritage of hawkers in 1965?
Okay. I think it's a very interesting question. So I think the way I see it is that hawkers or hawking generally as a phenomenon is really a representation of the economic and social conditions of a particular time. And I think in Singapore's case, most of the hawkers in that time were immigrants, right? Chinese and Indian immigrants, as we became a British colony. I think what you will see is mostly them hawking on the streets, right? Because it was easier. If you didn't have a job, you just took some homeware, went outside and started cooking food, right? Or
there was no NEA back then to enforce.
NEA back then. I think the first time they really tried to regulate it was with the Chinese protectorate, right? So actually, some of them asked the British to try and regulate it in the early 1900s. And the British was like, I don't want to do this. Can the Chinese protectorate do this? Because most of the hawkers are actually Chinese. So that was when the first regulation really came about, I think in 1907.
Okay.
But so I think what you will really see is that they were mostly itinerant hawkers, mostly informal or in some sense illegal, right? Because a lot of it is transitory, right? If I can't find a job or if I'm looking for another job, I can hawk on the side. And then so I think generally people find that, or I found that, hawkers as a percentage of the population is a good marker, right? And most developing countries have about 2.5% to 2% of their population working as hawkers, right? I think
okay.
in India, one of the parliamentary acts defines it as 2.5% in most cities. I think in Bangkok it's about slightly above 2% now. And in Singapore's case, it was also above 2% for quite a period of time. And so it was largely informally regulated, and they were all on the streets. And I think that mostly changed after independence.
I'm also curious, you did mention that most of the hawkers were Chinese. But of course, coming from different parts of China, right? So there are Hainanese cuisine, there is your Teochew or your Hokkien cuisine. But you also had other kind of races kind of join the fray in that period. What were some of the trends food-wise, right? Like when did the kind of Singapore food that we know and love today start to take shape? Was there a significant amount of Malay or Indian influence in Chinese dishes in the colonial period, or did that kind of come later on?
I'm not too sure about that. I think mostly it came later on, because if you look at... So I actually researched this during my master's thesis, and it was quite interesting because if you look at Singapore food and Malaysian Chinese food, they're quite similar, but there's still some nuances, right? But if you compare it to the southern Chinese food, right, it's almost completely different. The idea that Teochew Chinese, for example, can cook curry fish head is absurd to them, right? For them, like the Chinese in China just don't eat curry.
Yeah.
Right? But I think in Singapore, it sort of really mostly came about through that interaction with the different races, given that you're in such a small city, small locality. In Malaysia, you don't have this dynamic as much, right? I think the pressure to sort of interact with different races is a bit lesser. But they also have their own form of, like, I guess, organic multiculturalism. The idea that each person, like you see Indians speaking Chinese and Malay and Tamil and English. I think Singapore used to be a little bit more organic like that, but now it's a little bit more, I guess, structured, so to say.
And you break up the pre-colonial period into two different phases. Maybe can you briefly describe like what they were and why they're distinct?
Yeah, so I broke it into three phases. I think phase one was the colonial phase, phase two was the post-war phase, and phase three was the independent phase.
Okay.
So I think phase one was really how we sort of first saw the rise of hawkers in like colonial or modern Singapore, right? As I think most Singaporeans try.
So 1819 and after.
1819 and after. That's when you see the influx of immigrants and concomitantly the rise of hawkers or so, right? And I think after World War II, because there was economic depression, there's a lot of destruction, many took to hawking as well. I think that's where you really saw the highest number of hawkers per population, right? I think it was about 3%. It hit almost 3% for a period of time.
And this was all in informal economy still?
Informal economy still. I think they did a commission in 1951. They went and surveyed the hawker scene, and they found, it's about 3%. It's quite a large number of people working as hawkers.
This is the Hawkers Inquiry Report, right?
Hawkers Inquiry Report. And then in 1965 was, I think, when we got independence from Malaysia.
Well, not we think, we know.
Yeah. and I think that was really when I think we had more agency, I guess, to try and focus on this.
So that is like the start of this kind of third phase. Obviously we become a nation. Multiculturalism is a big part of our national identity, our national story at the time. And you mentioned in the book that there's this kind of core period, 1969 to 1973, 74, where there were the most hawker reforms in Singapore. Maybe you can touch on what happened. What did the government do during that period?
So I think generally, in terms of the instruments used to regulate hawkers, they have always been the same, I think, throughout. The idea that you have enforcement, so some kind of enforcement. In the past, it used to be the police. Now it's the NEA.
The police?
Yeah, in the past, it was the police. But now it was NEA, and or they have health authorities in the past. There's some form of licensing or registration. And the third form is there's some form of licensing, and shelters. Last one is shelters. Right. So I think it's usually a mixture of these three. And during the colonial era, even during our semi-independence era, you do see a little bit of that. I think the pictures try and show some books on how it has progressed across the years. But it was really in the independence phase after Lee Kuan Yew really decided, after the Keep Singapore Clean campaign, to really build up on this and implement these three forcefully, right, with the bureaucratic strength that the PAP built in the late 60s. Sorry.
So would you say that, during those early days of nationhood, the government actively saw hawker culture as an important tool for social integration, or was it more like a means to the end that they wanted a way to, just regulate a traditionally unregulated market? What was like the kind of political impetus behind these moves?
I think at its core, hawkers or regulation with hawkers really determined the types of political legitimacy the incumbent had, right? Because on one hand, right, the hawkers are seen as trying to provide for themselves, right, and that's why they have public sympathy, right? If the government can't provide enough jobs, then I have to go and hawk, right? So, and at the same time, they also provide like affordable food, right? So I think in the colonial era, it was seen as like a sort of de facto social safety net, right? It covered the blind spots of an inefficient government, right? And I think even the Thai authorities today hold that view, right? That hawking is a great way to sort of keep people gainfully employed to some extent, right? But on the flip side, it also creates a lot of problems if it's not regulated, right? They are unhygienic, they're unsanitary. Some of them in the past would be widely linked to public health issues like typhoid,
cholera,
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think what Singapore really did differently was they tried and formalize their street vending industry. Right? I think that was a very different approach that we took, right? Because in most developed countries, like let's say in Europe, right, it isn't hugely formalized, right? Mostly people joined the formal economy. Yeah.
I think that's interesting. I mean, as the next segments of the podcast goes, our listeners will know that I'm going to try and play devil's advocate and disagree. But I wanted to highlight one thing that you have said, but also extract what you think about it. From the Hawkers Inquiry report, I looked through it a little bit. And I think maybe we have not stated this enough, but the public nuisance that hawkers were actually quite a challenge to the government, right? I mean, public health was one, environmental issues were one. They were destroying the waters of Singapore, right? The kind of waste that they were producing and not being cleaned up. But also they were street nuisance, traffic nuisance. They couldn't regulate a lot of traffic, pedestrian walking, and that led to second, third factor dangers, right? And Lee Kuan Yew, I know he came out in 1970 and he said, for years we could not tidy up the city because of these illegal hawkers. And only in 1971, when we created many jobs for them, were we then able to enforce the laws and the regulations that slowly release them from the streets. So there is, in my mind, a trade-off that happens, right? I've always wondered about hawkers being signposted as people who give affordable food, right? Like you rightfully mentioned, it's a job of convenience. You don't aspire to be a hawker back then. You became a hawker. And therefore, food costing options were generally going to be low. It was not intended. It was an unintended circumstance of being a hawker. And the trade-offs were, and maybe you can speak about this, the general quality of food. But that led to deficiencies in public health, right? And it was a trade-off that was maybe more easily garnered by citizens, not by government, because we know Singapore is trying to clean them up. But then it's the first kind of social acceptance that these are the kind of food choices that I want. Would you agree with that? That trade-off was a social compact that was formed then?
Well, I'm not too sure whether it affected I guess in terms of the quality of food, maybe in terms of like its hygiene, definitely it does have an impact. But I think even in the colonial reports, in the very early colonial reports, when they tried to regulate, or some of them tried to eradicate hawkers completely, I think the health authorities and the police authorities were of the view that hawkers were always supposed to be eradicated or meant to be eradicated, right? And they held on to this belief and they tried to I guess, manage them and ring fence the issues. And generally because the colonial authorities were not strong enough to sort of eradicate them, so ring fencing was the option. But yeah, I would say that they did come to the realization that hawker food, even in its deficient form, was important for the pot, the growing pot.
Yeah.
The large number of immigrants working and down in the docks, I think hawkers really fed them.
Right.
I think every time they try to get rid of hawkers, there will always be a large political blowback against the colonial government. Right. So this resulted in a large tenuous relationship, right, especially between the public and the hawkers with the colonial government.
Right. Even till now, right? I think it's safe to say that this is kind of branched its head in different forms right now.
Yeah.
But I think for me the interesting thing here is, as we are setting the context of hawkers, is it's by circumstance that it was born out of it, but really the effects are multifold, especially when you start to look at it at a policy lens. Public health, transport, infrastructure, port, economic statuses, political will almost, right? That translates to even at some point who governs, how they govern, and what are the things that they have to do. So actually it's a very compounding factor, hawkers.
Yeah, exactly. So I think, before we move on to the next section, I kind of wanted to round off like the context of hawkers in Singapore. And so after 1969 to 1973, at some point then hawker centers as a government sort of policy started to pop up. And slowly there was a shift in mindset of the value of hawkers. Maybe you can kind of just like, what happened? Like, how did the first hawker centers come up? What were some of the early kind of policies to entice people to be part of these hawker centers from the government's perspective? And what else has happened in the market since, right? Because it's not just hawker centers that are filling this void. You have the HDB coffee shops. You have private coffee shops. There are many, many different forms of street food vendors that are now kind of formalized. What was the process for that to happen that has led us to what Singapore is now?
So I think in terms of hawker center development, interestingly, the way I conceive of it is the first hints of hawker centers really came about in the 1950 report. If you go through it, there's a section that mentions that the hawker or the government should plan for permanent hawker shelters that is planned in conjunction with wider urban development. I just think that in the 1950s, the government really didn't have the bureaucracy to engage with that, right? And I think they revisited it again in the 1960s after the independent government took over. And it was really pushed for, I think the first one was built in either 1969 or the early 1970s. And within 1969 to 1973, there was a huge rush to just build like a lot of hawker centers, to move and to relocate hawkers off the streets, to get them licensed. And it was really within that 4 years that I think we saw a huge, remarkable shift.
And when the government did this, from the hawkers' perspective, like, did most people stay in the trade? Was there a lot of pushback? Was it something that hawkers were, I guess, willing to accept, to move from an informal economy to a formalized economy?
I think in my perception, yes, because if you look at the data from 1965 to 1975, it was when Singapore saw the most rapid growth, right?
Yeah,
I think it was there. Our industrialization policy was in full steam ahead then, and this was also sort of fine-tuned by the hawkers department, right, where you could only get licensed if you couldn't get licensed if you're under 40. So under their one hawker, one license policy, it really transformed hawking into a sort of social need only vocation, right? Those who were able-bodied, they would actually, if they came to apply for a license, they were referred to the Ministry of Manpower then to either be upskilled.
Which is very different from what the national policy is now, right?
Yeah, it's very different.
Yeah, that's crazy.
So the idea was to really push or segue them into I guess productive industry, so to say. And they were really trying to move people away from being a hawker, because I think a lot of people then were quite dependent on being a hawker, and to really sort of upskill the human capital that Singapore had.
Of course.
So what kind of preserved this hawking culture then? I mean, now we're 2024, hawker culture is, I guess, a very controversial topic, but it's here, right? And now it's part of our national fabric. What helped to keep this, I guess, hawker culture alive from the 70s
The answer is
to now?
UNESCO.
What has kept it alive until now? I think it's really the demand for affordable food. The fact that affordable food helps to keep wages low generally. And that helps us to maintain competitiveness as a country as well. I think one thing that's quite surprising for me is that since 1978, the absolute number of hawkers has been around about 13 to 14,000, and it's actually the same till today, right? It's somehow, I think the government has managed to keep or incentivize about the same number of hawkers since then. I think it's quite amazing that these people have not transitioned out of hawking into productive industry. And maybe these are the individuals who I guess are vocational hawkers, right? And I think that's a rare breed in today's circumstance.
Because now, you do, when you go to a hawker center or coffee shop, you do see a lot of stall owners or operators who are very, very old. I go to Pek Gyo quite often because it's near my house. And the drinks guy, can barely stand up straight, right? So that's one side of it. But on the other hand, you do see a lot of people who are coming back into the industry. You have like a lot of university graduates who are trying it out. Or you have, I guess, people who are taking up this legacy policy, which the NEA has, right? So if you're a child of a hawker, you can bid for a stall at a much reduced rate. These things, I guess, have also helped to keep things alive, right?
Yeah, I do think so to some extent. That I think partially a lot of this is it's economic path dependency, right? Because for the first few batches, they were forcefully relocated off the streets into hawker centers. They were given a concessionary rate, and so much so that this concessionary rate has held until today, right? So some of these, I guess, subsidized or legacy hawkers are actually paying about $250 a month. Which in today's circumstance is a huge.
It's much lesser than $10,000.
Yeah, which in context, I think the average hawker stall is like 6,000 to 8,000 right now a month. Which is a lot.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just to wrap up the first segment, you've written this book. You say it's out of your research, but it's also a very important and maybe a national identity of Singapore. Before we wrap it up, I was just going to ask you to close this up. What do you hope for someone who reads your book in the future, and what do you hope for hawker culture?
So, that is the most contentious question always. What do I hope for hawker culture? I think everybody has a different idea of what they want hawker culture to be. But the way I see it is, I think when I was writing this book, I really wanted to understand what was the core principle. I guess Singaporeans are very concerned about, I think in governance, they're concerned about the principles of the policy, right?
Yeah.
And I think what I really found was that the principle of hawker centers or hawker culture, and modern hawker culture, if you can call it that, is that the function, right, was of it as a public amenity will always remain. The idea that it's sanitized, it's hygienic, it helps to control the urban discipline, the spatial discipline, and to some extent to help to depress food prices informally, right? And I think that function will remain, but what form the hawking will take in the future, I think that always changes. I think the form is perhaps a representation or a manifestation of what Singaporeans are then and then, right? Yeah. In the past, you have more older hawkers that sell a traditional type of food. Yeah. But in the future, maybe you have more like hippie hawkers that sell like craft beer. Right. And I think that is something that's a little bit more dynamic. The form is a little bit more dynamic, and where people hope it goes, I think everybody has their own view on it.
Right. Well, on that note, I hope you're right. And let's take a quick break. And come back and not have such a pleasant discussion about hawker, hopefully. All right, see you after the break.
So welcome back. We are still here with Ryan Kueh, the author of From Streets to Stalls, kind of a cultural history of Singapore's hawker culture. Really fascinating discussion, Vanan. Yeah. And I wanted to start this segment by asking something he wrote. Which really struck out to me about modern hawkers now in Singapore, which is that in the current kind of climate, hawkers, whether it's at coffee shops or at hawker centers, they're kind of pigeonholed to play two dual roles, right? One is that they're still the provider of affordable food for hundreds of thousands of people every day. You write yourself for families who are very busy, or for executives who need a quick fix. And so there's pressures on that, financial pressures on that. But they're also at the same time kind of now tasked with a social narrative, which is that they are the harbinger of hawker culture in Singapore, which is not just something that is discussed about, but actually is codified, right? Because UNESCO has, like we mentioned before, made Singapore hawker culture a heritage thing.
Yeah.
And I was really fascinated that these are can be very contradictory roles, right? And I wanted to ask you, like, one, the implication that I have made, is that a fair one? But two, what are some of the problems that this has caused for hawkers now?
I think that's a very interesting question. So I think in the book, the way I saw it was that it's really towards a part of Singaporeans, I guess, their angst towards something that they're losing, right? I think for a lot of the older executives, it's about like, oh, I've had this char kway teow for a long time, and now the char kway teow guy is retired. Right? So how do I get my char kway teow, good char kway teow
They
fix?
shouldn't eat so much char kway teow, first of all, but not so good for the heart.
Yeah. But I think the idea is that, I think what people don't realize is that this cultural aspect of, I guess, hawkers is something that is a second or perhaps even a third order effect. It was something that was, I guess, layered upon only in modern times, right? Because if you think about it in the past, hawker centers are truly a public amenity. They're just there to provide an instrument for a space to go for cheap and affordable food.
Yeah.
But the idea that it's a cultural space, a sociological space, a political space even, I guess it's a lot newer, right? And so if you read I think I was reading the way the hawker UNESCO nomination came about, right? And apparently it was by asking, by connecting different focus groups with the grassroots, and they were asking them, amongst like Ge Thai, amongst hawker centers, and amongst a lot of other like local performances, which do you resonate most with? And surprisingly, I think Singaporeans voted. Everyday Singaporeans voted for hawker centers, and that was how the government chose hawker centers to submit in the UNESCO bid, right? So I think also partially it's interesting that Singaporeans have organically come to see this as a culture. So in some sense, I guess they are responsible for creating this angst in so to say also. But hopefully, I do think a lot of this angst is to sort of deal with the fact that Singapore is struggling to find our own identity. Even 50 years later, 50 years on, and that we have something that's uniquely ours. I think something that's not, I guess, engineered to some extent. Something that the lay people think that, I think this is something that's uniquely Singaporean, different from, I guess, Malaysia and Indonesia and the countries around it. And they're sort of struggling with that contention of, I guess, modernity and heritage, right? And I think Singapore as after moving so fast, I guess that's one of the second order problems.
Yeah. So I think that brings me to maybe the more controversial question here, which is if somehow allegedly the Singapore government has stumbled upon this great cultural nuance or this great cultural, I guess, identity that has and the groundwork for this has been laid by on the backs of laborers for decades and decades. What is then your view of like what the responsibility is of the government to ensure that hawkers now can still have a fair shake of it? In lieu of the fact that we know there are some hawkers who can get hawker rentals for very, very cheap if they have a legacy. But some hawkers, for example, just last week or two, an NEA hawker center stall was tendered at $10,000 a month. I mean, that's a huge disparity. I mean, I just kind of want to know your thoughts on that.
So I do think, like, to sort of really answer the question, for me, as long as the government provides the conditions for the functions of the hawker centers to continue, I think the rest is up to the free market. And I think hawker centers or hawking in general has always been sort of managed by the free market, right? Like I do think if you go to a hawker center, it's almost the epitome of a perfect competition, right? You have like 30 stores competing side by side with each other. It's very clear of this chicken rice is 350, this chicken rice is 320. If I really want a good quality one, I'll go for that. If I'm a value buyer, I'll go for the cheaper one. But I think the government's stance is, in my opinion, should be to just provide the conditions for it, right? Ensure that the market assessed rents are still affordable, to help I guess, upgrade amenities, right? So for example, like you have hawker center renovations nowadays. And so even if the hawker center goes under renovation and restoration, there isn't an increase in rents, right? In some cases, they're even given rental remission, some hawkers. I think that's great. So, and also to sort of answer your point on the legacy rents. So if I'm not wrong, they're not giving legacy rents anymore.
Okay.
And on the point on like the market assessed rents, right? The idea that $10,000 hawker centers or hawker bits are in the market currently, I think that is sort of kind of a way to try and play or sort of incentivize that free market policy. But sometimes it can go a bit out of whack, right? I think alongside COEs or like HDB resale prices, I think sometimes it's like a bit like that. But I think what most people don't realize is that after 3 years, this rent, this $10,000 a month rent will go back down to an assessed rent, which is about 1.2 to 1.5 thousand a month.
Yeah.
So I think for the hawkers themselves, it's really a long-term economic play, right? If you think about that.
That's the good nuance that is not in the headlines, right? That a $10,000 hawker stall, if you bid down after 3 years, the rental will go down to $1,500.
If you manage to survive.
If you manage to survive,
So
definitely.
So the economic principle here is almost how much you bid to survive and then maintain somewhat of a steady flow. Yeah. It is also important, I guess, while we're having this discussion, to note and contextualize that not everyone's bidding $10,000 for.
Yeah. Right.
I've seen the NEA tender bids. A lot of people are bidding $3, $8, $480. So it's on a, as you would rightfully have pointed out, it's on different factors, on the kind of food that you have. So in that sense, I guess the free market is working, right? In the sense that for what value, for what kind of food, in which area, based on what footfall. So there are other considerations that not only the government takes, but also the tenderer is empowered enough to make based on his or her opinion.
Yeah.
And it's, it doesn't mean that the highest bidder wins. So maybe not pure free market in the sense. NEA has the right to, in its own authority, cancel out any of those tenders, but everything is transparent and put on the NEA website. Yeah. So you're aware every month.
Yeah, but I think that's an interesting point, because in some sense, the hawker tenders are it is in its own market, right? Because you're bidding within like different hawker stalls. But I think the real comparison to like the true market value is if you look at the coffee shop that's like maybe right opposite that hawker center, right? Then I think in that sense, you can really see how much the government is subsidizing each store and the difference of it, right? So I think that is the true comparison between what is that subsidized rent and what is the true market appraised value of that land.
Yeah,
I'm really glad you brought that topic up, because as we were discussing this and preparing a little bit, I was genuinely a little bit confused, as maybe some of our listeners, viewers might be as well, on the difference between hawker and food courts, right? And so in general, just to lay out the facts, and please correct me if I'm wrong, hawker centers there are about 120 hawker centers in Singapore, with approximately about 14 to 15,000 stalls, I suppose, and they're very much managed by NEA. Right, and there's a hawker group association that sits within NEA that looks after some of the regulatory affairs around the hawker centers.
Can you imagine being the deputy director of hawker affairs?
I can't, which is why I'm doing the podcast. But then food courts come very much under the purview of HDB, and almost coffee shops. Yeah. Coffee shops come under the purview of HDB, and slightly half of it is controlled by them, but the other half is privatized, private owned. Yep. As of 1998. HDB doesn't sell or lease out HDB coffee shops to the private market anymore. So inherently, in terms of who governs this, there is a difference. But you can have hawkers in a hawker center, and you can also have hawkers in a coffee shop, right? But for me, as we are talking about food prices and this responsibility to keep food prices low, there is also, for me, a trade-off on the future of the hawkers, right? Because if a hawker bids for a hawker license in an NEA-administered hawker center, that person is, the one who's making that decision for how many, for the first 3 years, how much of rent I want to bid for before market forces kicks in. Whereas in a coffee shop, particularly a private-owned one, which I guess there are more than half of those, the person who bids then issues out rents for the people who are hawking in those coffee shops. And generally, I think we know in Singapore that it's significantly more expensive. The costs that are are coming is very different. So the variance for a hawker in a hawker center and a coffee shop is very different. Should more be done to make sure that the outcomes are similar? And when everybody wants to see this growth model for themselves, for their kids, we know it's been a legacy thing because we've been a developing economy for a while, but now we're a developed economy. Who should look after the growth of these hawkers? For me, that's an important question. Do you think that's being addressed, or at least in the research, when you're doing your book, did you find that a contentious topic being discussed in Singapore?
So I think for me, it's not so much about the contention of it. I think the way I see it is that, so I think generally as a rule of thumb, I guess food courts and coffee shops are privately owned. I think except for coffee shops, there are some that are owned by HDB. And I think the key distinctifier of a hawker center is that it's government subsidized, right? Or the stalls are government subsidized, and generally it's run by NEA. I think interestingly, you brought up the point about coffee shops. I think coffee shop leases being sold by HDBs. I think in 2010, somewhere around 2010 and 2015, there was a short period of time where I think the government tried to sell leases of coffee shops back again. And what happened was that there was a huge property play on coffee shops.
Yeah.
And so people developers started trying to flip coffee shops as they flip property. Right?
Well, I mean, in Yishun, everyone knows in Yishun there's a coffee shop that just 2-3 years ago sold for $42 million.
Wow.
With only like 50 years left on the lease.
Wow.
Yeah. So it is issues like that. And I think the government has sort of clamped down on that after they tried that model again. So I think there is a lot of government, I guess, oversight on food-related, I guess, property prices. Right, and that's why now you still see a lot of HDB-owned coffee shops, and I think they're also being used as a vehicle to provide affordable food, right? And that's why there's that budget options that I think they're trying to introduce now. But that's another topic, right? So I think generally the idea is that the government is somewhat. I think there's a good equilibrium now. They are trying to introduce more hawker centers with the SCHC model. I think that's quite new, and
that's the social enterprise.
The social enterprise hawker centers. I think that is a new model. I think they're trying out different ways that they can, I guess, fine tune this equilibrium. But I would say, from a very high level view, this is a very tightly run ship. And I guess trying to steer the ship in a different direction completely would be quite difficult.
I mean, it's interesting that you say that, and it's a good point to note, I guess, right? When we're having this discussion, as we talk about tendering, rents, there's a parliamentary question posed to Minister Grace Fu in July this year about what is the cost for a lot of these hawkers, and she said that an NEA survey showed that raw materials and manpower were the main cost drivers for the hawkers. So the cost of the tendering wasn't some of their main priority. This, I guess, is important because, I think at the beginning of this year, we found out that in 2023, the prices of hawkers and their food went up by 6.3%, which is significantly more than the average of 2.2% since 2012 to 2022. This is obviously down to a lot of the effects of the pandemic. Also, you can relate that to supply chain disruptions. But when people go to a hawker center and they see affordable food options like what you mentioned, char kway teow, fried rice, but they see things like chicken chop, Wagyu beef fillet for $16.50. For someone who is maybe not enshrined in a lot of the hawker doctrine that you might have immersed yourself in, the affordable food option conversation doesn't really stand for very long, or doesn't maybe test the water enough for me.
Oh, that's your perspective.
At least from my perspective. I mean, I guess you could argue that $16.50 is affordable for some people,
sure,
and not affordable for others. But the moment you make it, in my opinion, a national identity, a symbol, then you vote for and you put it in the UNESCO cultural kind of list. Should there be a way you define affordable meals when you get to a hawker center? And is there a disadvantage if you're a hawker trying to keep your food prices low? Then you see across your hawker center aisle, someone is serving $15-16 pasta or something like that. What do you think?
So I think there's two parts to this question. The first part is on, I guess, the rents, right? I think that's a very interesting point you brought up about like the recent inflation of food prices, because I think when I was researching in 2018, so I was reading this, that the market assess the median monthly rent according to SMS Amy Core was $1,250 since 2018
in NEA hawkers.
in NEA hawkers,
Okay.
right? And that was I think this is in 2023, and that accounted for about 9% of hawker operating costs, so below 10%, which is actually quite amazing. So this is actually lower than a 2014 study which showed that the median rent of hawker rents amounts up to 12%. So to some extent, the percentage of rent being in the operating costs actually decreased across the years, and even through the COVID crisis. Right? And I think that perhaps speaks to how much the government is subsidizing implicitly throughout inflation, especially for rent. But it also speaks to the pressure of like the manpower costs, the food costs, right? And I think it is true that a lot of the pressures of profit is also placed upon the hawkers themselves, right?
Yeah.
Because especially for a lot of the older hawkers, they are very price sensitive, right? Those that are known as in Chinatown, there's one hawker that sells Yong Tau Fu for $3.50, right? If he or she tries to raise their price by 20 cents, right, and that's quite difficult for them, right? Because they've been operating on that model for such a long time.
Correct.
Your second question on whether we should sort of label, I guess, try and label or constrain the idea of like what is Singaporean food. I think it's quite difficult, I guess. For some of the old uncles, if you see this young chap selling like pasta $15, you also feel like, oh, maybe I can do that. So, but I think, like I previously said, I do think when you go to the hawker center, you accept the fact that it's a perfect competition, right? And I think there is enough stores and enough customers to sort of match with one another. And I think generally the people who want to go for $15 pastas are not the same customers,
Right.
or maybe not on that day specifically, right? That as the one that goes for the $3.50 chicken rice.
Yeah. Actually, that is the point I think that I'm trying to make, right? I think a lot of the long-standing hawkers from the different bit of research that I did before this pod from IPS and people who have done the surveys, a lot of hawkers are very much enshrined and attached to their customer base, right? And they feel it when they rise, even if a 10% rise could be a 6 cents or 12 cent rise.
Correct.
They do not necessarily look at themselves first, which I guess is the real admirable nature of a hawker, but rather what it might do to their long-serving customers. And I think it's also fair to make that assumption that if you are selling $15 Wagyu filet fried rice in a hawker center, your customer base is somewhat new relatively in comparison, but also the people that you're catering to are also very, very different. So it's not just that the audience are different, but the segment, the history, and the way you price some of these things are different. Which then, if you follow that strain of conversation, if you feel so much about raising the prices, one, they might reduce the portion of the food, because they're not running a charity, right? They're also trying to make some money. And there have been concerns that has been raised to IPS and NEA that if I get the same price of food, nowadays I'm seeing my portion of rice lower, my portion of chicken lower. Maybe the Singaporean identity is that we like to complain. Maybe that is what should be on UNESCO. But generally, if you take these two strands of development, then the person who's going to feel very sensitive about raising their prices are not going to make that much money, whereas they're running a business in a perfect or in a free market environment for business, which is not self-serving if you're a business owner, right?
Yeah, but I mean, the government can't do anything about that, right? I mean, if the hawker decides that, okay, for my business, this is my nuance, this is how I'm going to go to market, the government can support with like better rentals and providing grants and stuff like that. But it's not the government's job to say, oh, you must sell at a higher price or at a lower price. I think even now today, like the government is trying to respond to complaints about rising cost of food. Even in my own constituency work, I know like people complain to me or complain to us when they say, a cup of coffee used to be $1.10, now it's $1.50 in the kopitiam. But I think the reality is that a lot of these prices are quite sticky. They're not going to come back down, but the angst of raising them up is still a lot, even for the hawkers, because in their minds it also means like supply and demand would dictate that as prices go up, the demand would come down too.
True, and the government has made some steps on it. To be fair, they've they have decided to build much more hawker centres till 2027. This is to ramp up the supply of hawkers that they feel would bring prices down. And there's a push now to try and make food more affordable and also accessible at the same time, which maybe then brings us very naturally to the conversation about these budget meal options that are being presented. And I know you are going to bring up this statement by a local food critic.
Yeah. I mean, I think, as we approach the end, one of the kind of more viral newsy things that has come out, aside from your book, the last couple of weeks, is that KFCito, who many kind of see as like the godfather of hawker culture in Singapore now, he came out and criticized the government, saying that the current budget-friendly meals, which for those who don't know, the government is working with hawkers and NTUC-owned coffee shops and some other privately owned coffee shops to make sure that there's options for affordable meals, which are meals that are less than $2.50 in coffee shops. And KFCito said that these were abusive and stifling to hawkers because they're forced to keep the prices low at a time where they can, right? I mean, have you heard from the ground, or have you heard from people what the reality is? Like, do you think this is a fair assessment?
I haven't heard much from the ground, I think, thus far. And I think also partially because the mechanism hasn't kicked in yet. Right? I believe it's only going to kick in next year, or in 2026. But I think very preliminarily, the way I see it is quite difficult to set like a price and get hawkers to sort of meet that price, right? Because let's say, for example, if you sell chicken rice, right? If for $4 you already get like X amount of rice and like X amount of chicken, to say that, oh, I need you to set below your current, whatever you're currently selling, then you naturally get something that's lesser, right? And I think for some hawkers that may put a strain on their operations. And I don't know how, I do think that in some extent it is sort of contradictory to the idea of that free market, letting the free market play out. Because the way I see it is the government's way has always been to just incentivize the conditions for it.
Yes.
Right, provide the structures, ensure that the function continues as it is, and the free market will solve itself there. Right. Also, in some sense, set the parameters of the market. Yeah. Right. And once the parameters are set, then ensure that that hopefully whatever is within is good enough to sort of incentivize the right conditions.
Look, as time runs out, one last question from myself, which I wanted to ask also is about the kind of corporatization of hawker centers, right? So we see very often now entire coffee shops are owned and operated or just operated by chains like Shengxiong, which they're the ones that bought the $40 million coffee shop in Yisun. S11, very famous. Kim Lee, like you mentioned. And of course you have like the Kopitiam, which are owned by NTUC and stuff like that. I wanted to bring this up because they hire a lot of new staff who are not part of the culture to do the work. How has this changed hawker culture in Singapore? And even after that, like, how do you kind of foresee hawker culture in Singapore moving forward?
I think that's a great question. I think for me, the way I see it, it's I think coffee shops are in some sense a proxy of hawker centers, right? Because they may not have the same or partake in the same conditions, but by some extent, I think implicitly they also need to sort of match the hawker center prices. Like for example, I personally am more positive about it because I go mostly to a coffee shop because the coffee shop is nearer to my house.
Yeah.
And I do realize that coffee shops serve the same, I guess, proxy functions of affordable food to some extent. But also when you have more diversity of people working inside, like so this Cai Fan lady at that I always get my lunch at, she's Vietnamese, speaks Chinese. Yeah. And the customer base that they serve is not only just, I guess, Singaporeans living in the estate around, but also this group of construction workers that are building HDBs, and they're mostly Chinese. And it's interesting to see how these Chinese or Chinese foreign workers take to things like Cai Fan.
Yeah.
Right. So there's this one guy in particular. Every day he will order Cai Fan with extra curry.
Oh.
Right. And from his accent, you can tell he's from a northern part of China, so they don't eat spicy food too much, but this guy has really taken the curry, and every day he'll ask for the extra curry. He will ask for the sweet and sour pork. He'll ask for the taugeh.
Very hearty stuff.
So very southern Chinese stuff. So I think even then, I think it's interesting to see how people sort of assimilate into this Singaporean culture, and I guess in some sense built onto it as well.
Yeah.
I think on that Vietnamese lady as well, there's another Vietnamese lady that runs a appam stall in, I think, Maxwell, called Mr. Appam.
And a Vietnamese lady running an appam shop.
Yeah, and it's very interesting because I think she's a Vietnamese housewife, and she mistakenly applied for a Indian stall in Maxwell. And so she was like, oh damn, I can't pull out because it's Maxwell, right? So she learned how to make appam online, if I remember correctly.
Oh my gosh.
And now she's doing pretty well. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's fabulous. I mean, there's this whole other topic about race-based foods, how much of these incentives are going to who needs food most affordable in what race groups. But I mean, you can talk about hawker and its effects on so many aspects of different things, right? So it's a really interesting topic. I mean, just before we close, I don't really have a question, I think, but when I started doing some research for this pod, I was generally a bit skeptical in the future of hawker centers, and I think that's the kind of last question that I want to ask you. As for me, I feel like when you go to a hawker center, particularly if I bring friends from overseas, it's a great sellable thing for Singapore, right? Sit outside, it's a good representation of this country, but the quality of food, I have not found it to be that great. I go to a few shops that I really want to go, and I'm willing to pay a bit more to get a better quality of food. Now, if the current trajectory just maybe stands on its own, part of me when I go and I see hawkers and the lifestyle that they lead, it's not easy. It's quite tough. They work extremely long hours. Over COVID, some of them had to increase their hours from 9 a.m. to maybe even 9 p.m. Some might even see it's a thankless job, how we have gotten rid of ladies cleaning up the trays or gents cleaning up the trays. I wonder if these are also the kinds of industries that we want to see us change, get some of them different kinds of jobs. For me, what was really interesting is in the 70s, in the 60s, as we talked about in the first segment, hawkers were something that we were actively trying to get rid of in Singapore, and now it's on a UNESCO cultural heritage side. It's in a way impressive, but also it does make me question whether that's the direction that we want to go, particularly as the government is trying to incentivize to be more careful in our food choices, generally in the way we lead our lifestyles. Yes, affordable food is good, but I wonder if 20, 30, even 40 years down the road, whether, by largely due to economies of scale, there'll just be a centralized kitchen, a robot might just make all of the really cheap food, and the government will just control the prices of chicken. I mean, especially if Malaysia doesn't want to sell us and increase the price. I wonder if that might just be the healthier, faster option and still keep it to somewhat competitive. I wonder really if it's a dying trade. I mean, I know there's an emotive connection to this, but like a lot of things in the past, when the future comes up, things have to change, right? And I wonder if this cultural attachment to this UNESCO Heritage site might be a bit of a burden. But yeah, the question is, what do you think for the future of hawker, and what do you hope?
So I think first off, I want to challenge your point that hawker center food is lower quality. I think hawker center food is great quality in my opinion. I think, and I think that's why you can really find. I think usually you can find really great ones, and even then, on average, it's still pretty good. I think it's rarer to. I think when you find a really bad hawker food, I think that is more of a interesting find to find a really bad hawker food. But for me, I do see that this culture continuing because it has been so, I guess, ingrained in Singaporean way of life, right? Especially for the lay person in the heartlands. To put it very simply, I think as long as there's HDBs, hawker centers will continue. Because hawker centers are there to serve the HDBs primarily. And I think in the next few years will be interesting as there are newer hawkers coming into the play. You are right that I think in the past it used to be a vocation of necessity, but now it's a vocation of choice, right? And I guess the younger generation also wants like better work-life balance, and you do see that with younger hawkers, right? Some young hawkers, they work 6 hours maybe, or 8 hours, or they work only lunch and dinner times. And I think that's a great move, right? I don't think we should be expecting young or future hawkers to work the same long hours as before. And in the same case, I don't think we should be expecting the old hawkers to work the same hours that they used to work before. So I do think that hawker centers are here to stay, and hawker culture is here to stay, because even in everyday politics, hawker centers are really so important, right? And I think in the upcoming GE, you will realize that the hawker centers become the key battleground, right?
Yeah.
Right. So much so that the MPs or the contestants like to go to the hawker center to be seen. I think it's quite rare for people to go to the hawker center in like a button-up shirt and long pants, right? So I think it's intentional for sure. They are there. They make the point to go down there to be seen as a group, to say hi with the Heartlanders. So as GE season is around the corner, I think people will keep an eye out for hawker centers again.
Well, thanks, Ryan, for being on the show. The book is From Streets to Stalls. The author is Ryan Kueh. You can get this at most bookshops, Kinokuniya, online. It's published by World Scientific, a very good publisher in Singapore. Thank you for being on.
Thanks for coming on to Local Politics. Hopefully join us again one day soon.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.